Welcome to the latest episode of MQ's Open Mind podcast. Craig and I are delighted today. We've got a really fascinating conversation, we hope, which is forthcoming. And we've got our guest today is Professor David Nutt. And David is the Edmond J. Safra Professor of Neuropsychopharmacology and the head of the Psychedelics Research Centre at Imperial College London. So welcome, David, and thanks for joining us on our podcast today.
Great to be here. I see it's your 10th anniversary and I was there at the launch. So
okay, yeah.
Brilliant.
So this will probably come out in and around the actual anniversary in the autumn. So that's excellent. So David, I was doing a bit of reading around you, so your journey, and I'll be really curious to hear about your journey. So I think it's gone from Bristol, Cambridge, Oxford. Then you did Bethesda and outside Washington, and back then to Bristol, and then to Imperial. Mm-hmm. So can you maybe tell us a bit about your journey then, and what we're interested in the podcast is where your sort of interest in sort of mental health and psychiatry came, and then obviously the work you've done since.
I could point you to my autobiography, but it's not uncut. You can read all about it, but very, very brief précis. Fascinated about science when I was 10 at junior school, when they showed us how you detected the power of atmospheric pressure. Became fascinated by the mind when I was about 16, 17, starting my A-levels, listening to people like Gray Walter talk about EEGs and how you can measure things going on in the brain. Went to university to do natural sciences at Cambridge, but just realized before I turned up I would rather do medicine than zoology. So I switched to medicine because it was easier to study what I wanted to study, which was humans. Trained in medicine at Guy's Hospital and St. Mary's Hospital. And then went back into research where I've been ever since. Started off doing neurology, got bored with that, moved to psychiatry. That's infinitely fascinating. And, you never saturate your knowledge base with psychiatry. And gravitated towards pharmacology because the explanatory power of neurotransmitters and receptors is just overwhelming. I was trained at Cambridge by people like Jimmy Mitchell, who discovered GABA as a neurotransmitter, and Les Iverson, who discovered noradrenaline uptake sites. So I've always been fascinated by the explanatory power and, of course, then subsequently the clinical utility of drugs. And that's what I've done ever since. And my sort of claim to fame, I think, is that I've probably given more different kinds of drugs, particularly brain-acting drugs, particularly illegal drugs, to humans than anyone alive, maybe ever. No one's ever challenged me on that anyway.
Well, I suppose it's a claim to fame of some degree, certainly. But I think from what always has impressed me in the work you've done is everything you do is obviously evident. It's in the pursuit of science and knowledge and therapeutic benefit, but it's all grounded in. So you made that sort of flippant remark about giving drugs to lots of people, but it is to build the evidence base. And I suppose maybe that brings me on to sort of the next sort of question, which is like there is so much scaremongering. I don't know if scaremongering is the correct term, but a lot of concern about some of the work that you and your colleagues have been involved in over the years. Mm-hmm. And I suppose it's maybe to get your sense on, well, why do we think it has been the sort of risks versus harms versus benefits have been sort of arguably taken out of proportion?
Well, that's another book. It's called Drugs Without the Hot Air. It's because drug policy is largely driven by political expediency, which goes back, interestingly, right back to the turn of the last century, the Hague Convention, when pharmaceutical companies realized that they could patent primitive derivatives of endogenous natural compounds. They could turn morphine into codeine or heroin and get patents and control the market. So they wanted to eliminate the natural products. So that was the beginning of the whole sort of IP control. And then, of course, the prohibition of alcohol in America and Scandinavia in the 1920s, which led to major problems that, of course, like the rise of the mafia, which led to the abolition of prohibition in 1933. But at the same time, it led to the growth of the Drug Enforcement Agency in the States, and the repeal of alcohol prohibition was going to make 335,000 people unemployed. So they had to come up with some other drug to be worried about. So they invented the fears of cannabis, called it marijuana. And then basically the war on drugs has been perpetuated through the need to keep those people employed and the need to get particularly Republican politicians elected, although I have to say the Democrats have also been pretty reprehensible. So American policy of using drugs as a way of getting votes and the war on drugs, particularly from Nixon, And the fact that all our drug laws have been made at the behest of the Americans means, and as have all the drug laws around the world in the UN and the WHO. So the bottom line is drug policies are politically and economically driven rather than scientifically driven. And that is both outrageous, immoral, and also extremely destructive, because there are many drugs that are really useful. Drugs like medical cannabis, which have been around for 4 to 5 millennia, drugs like psychedelics, which were proving really very effective in the 50s and 60s, they've been denied to the public, to the sick public, for the last 50 years, which is absolutely, totally. It's the worst censorship of research in the history of the world. And I, I've rebelled against that. I think if one thing science should do is, at the very least, challenge those kind of misperceptions and political decisions.
But then, in that context, then, so in terms of trying to get funding for your research, I know, so there, because obviously the challenge then is when you're funded by pharmaceutical companies, there's obviously risks and challenges there in terms of access to data and whatever vested interest. So how have you dealt with that bit of it, and then also trying to get funding from other organizations independent of drug companies?
We've taken a sort of multi-track approach. So one of the things I've got quite good at is writing grants to explore the harms of drugs. And of course, that requires studying drugs. So we've done an enormous amount of work, particularly using brain imaging to explore questions like the nature of addiction, the nature of alcohol addiction versus heroin addiction versus cocaine addiction. So that's given us the framework of the brain research. But to study more challenging drugs, particularly drugs like MDMA and psychedelics, we've largely gone to philanthropists because particularly in America, there are quite a lot of very rich people who believe, possibly correctly, that the use of psychedelics is why they became visionaries and very successful. And Silicon Valley is full of people who've made ridiculous amounts of money and are very sympathetic to the idea that psychedelics were part of that. And, when you think, I'm talking to you on my Airbook Mac and Steve Jobs, Steve Jobs built the biggest company the world's ever known based on having a trip in which he realized it was possible to fuse art and computers. And
I didn't hear that story before.
No, absolutely. He says that his LSD trip was one of the 5 most important experiences, and it's thought that, in fact, the idea that his what is the Mac vision? The Mac vision is to have beautiful engineering rather than just functional engineering, and that accords extremely well with most people. Most people like beautiful things, particularly if they can tell you where you are and where you've got to go, and what your heart, all those sorts of things. So, and of course, history. There are many very famous people who've used psychedelics to change the way they view the world. I mean, Francis Crick, of course, our Nobel Prize winner, is perhaps the most interesting example in my mind, because he cracked the DNA code with Jim Watson, and that was in the 1950s, and late 50s he discovered LSD and realized actually that was a simple question. Solving DNA, that was actually a pretty trivial question. The big problem was solving the mind. And he went to the States and spent the last 20 years of his life trying to understand the nature of the brain. Unfortunately, he didn't have the tools. He didn't have the imaging tools to do that. But he wrote some interesting theories, and some of his ideas are still relevant today.
Yeah, but on that, you mentioned the imaging, the brain imaging work, and obviously that's a really key plank of the work that you're doing now. So if somebody said to you, a non-scientist said, what is imaging? How has imaging advanced our understanding of addiction, say, or the harms, or the mechanisms of effect with drugs? How would you answer that?
That's just a trivial question, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I'm just trying to think, okay, in terms of, give it 2 or 3 examples for somebody who knows about brain imaging but doesn't know what it is. Okay,
well, let's start with a simple piece of imaging. Let's start at what you call volumetric imaging. Let's look at changes to the brain. Well, one of the things we discovered, and in fact, it was discovered even before we had modern imaging, in the old days when we used to inject air into people's CSF and measure the size of their brain using just X-rays. We knew that the brains of people who are very alcohol dependent are shrunk, and we can see that categorically. When we do studies of alcoholics, we find that many of them have brains which look like Alzheimer's brains. They're as shrunken as shriveled. In fact, they're the only group of drug-using patients that actually do have obvious morphological changes to their brain. So that's the first thing. Alcohol, it can be very damaging to the brain, not just the poison of alcohol or the glutamate toxicity and withdrawal, but also the fact that, of course, people often get head injuries as a result of being drunk and falling over and getting beaten up. And then we can look at the chemistry. I mean, a lot of my work has been focused on the the neurochemistry of addiction. And we can address that, in a very sophisticated, intimate way by doing PET imaging, positron emission tomography. And you can show that, there are disorders of the release, say, of endorphins in many addictions. And we now think that part of the underlying pathology of addiction is a disruption of the endorphinergic state. So, for example, we know that with particular challenges that release endorphins, addicts have subsensitivity to those challenges. So the normal kind of intervention, which most of us would get pleasure from through the release of endorphins, doesn't happen in people who are addicted. That system has become atrophied or blunted. And we believe that many people become addicted to a particular drug because that's the one drug that actually does turn on that system. So it's a kind of explanatory aspect of the nature of the development of addiction itself. And then we can add to that, looking at functional imaging with MRI, we can look at the circuits, we can look at the reward systems, we can look at to what extent in different addictions are associated with different perturbations in reward, liking, or impulse control, or mood dysregulation. So we can actually build up, quite sophisticated profiles of individuals based on brain imaging.
And so then moving on to the Psychedelics Research Centre, then so when did you establish that, and what work are you doing within the Psychedelics Research Centre at the minute?
Yeah, so the centre was founded 5 years ago. It was founded based on about 10 years of work, which I started at Bristol University and then carried on at Imperial. We moved the team to Imperial just to have better access to imaging. I've been imaging from Bristol since the mid-90s, early 90s, but it was getting a bit tedious trucking up and down the motorway with patients, especially when the train stopped running. So we moved the whole team to Imperial and became very successful. So one of my star PhD students, a guy called Robin Carhart Harris, became quite well known for the work we did on psilocybin imaging and psilocybin treatment of depression. And he's a very captivating individual. He charmed some of these rich Americans, and they gave us money to set up the center. Mm-hmm. As I say, it's been going for 5 years. The challenge, of course, is to keep on raising the money. Now that he's gone to America, most American universities now have their own psychedelic research centers, and they're sucking all the American money to them rather than to. So we're a little bit farther away than from the sort of the main beating heart of philanthropy in Britain. But we're working on it.
Yeah, and so were you one of the first psychedelics research centers in the world at the time?
We were the first. The
first, yeah. Okay, And then in terms of the evidence for psilocybin then, mm-hmm. So what does the evidence tell us about its effectiveness in terms of treatment of depression?
Well, and maybe if I just sort of preface that a little bit by saying, as I said earlier on, what my expertise is giving drugs to people and seeing what drugs do in their brain.
Yeah.
The work that Robin and I did on imaging psilocybin, LSD, DMT was driven largely by the question, what are those receptors? Why is your brain full of serotonin 2A receptors? And what we know that we knew that psychedelics stimulate those receptors. So, but what is the link between stimulating the receptor and having a psychedelic experience? And we discovered that that link was a profound perturbation in rhythmic brain activity, a complete disruption of synchronous brain activity, a fragmentation of activity, producing what we call the entropic brain, a very, very chaotic form of brain activity. Turns out that chaos can be useful in breaking down patterns of thinking which are abnormal in disorders like depression. And it was that discovery that led us to do the depression studies. And to our delight, it turned out that you can disrupt the competitive negative thought loops in depression. You can break those. You can put the brain, like a reset. You can put the brain back into another way of working, a more efficient and more flexible and more desired way of working. And now we've been rolling it out into other disorders where, again, people get locked into mindsets like anorexia, like OCD, even like pain syndromes, where people cannot stop having that mental experience, and we think psychedelics can disrupt it and help them escape.
So, but do we know the longer term benefits? So you said it changes the ways of thinking and so on. But do we know yet whether those changes happen or are sustained over the longer term?
Well, we don't know whether the physiological measures in the brain are, but we certainly know that the psychological changes are, because in our first depression study, of the 20 patients, and these were patients with treatment-resistant depression, they'd all failed on at least 2 antidepressants, some had failed on 10, they'd all failed on CBT. About a quarter of them are still well 10 years later. It's like they've reset, they're no longer depressed. It's like a core. And that is the most powerful, I mean, that study was the most powerful outcome in treatment-resistant depression from a single intervention ever. A single psilocybin intervention is as powerful as 4 weeks of ECT. And it's way less expensive and way more patient acceptable because it doesn't screw up your memory. So the long-term effects can be permanent, probably. But for most people, and these were difficult to treat people, their depression begins to creep back. And that tells us something really important. It confirms what we've all known for a long time, that if depression gets entrenched in your brain, possibly as a result of childhood trauma or chronic trauma, it can be very difficult to extirpate, to get rid of. So we're now looking at ways of trying to maintain wellness after that period. Most of the effect is, we still get significant effects even at 6 months, but the tendency is for the depression to creep back, especially in people who've had chronic depression, repeated episodes of depression.
So would this area of research be useful for people who have experience with drugs? So let's say someone who has some previous addiction. Could they use this type of treatment?
Indeed, they could. And in fact, there are studies that have now, there are 2 major studies, one to help people stop smoking and one to help people stop drinking. And they both show big effects of just 1 or 2 psilocybin doses over a course of 6 months to help people get mastery over those 2 addictions. And in fact, the smoking study was so remarkable, with something like 70% of people stopping completely for 6 months. It's way more powerful than any other intervention to stop people smoking. That for the first time in 55 years, the US National Institute of Health is funding psychedelic research. Wow. We, by the way, I want to give a little plug to us. So, we're particularly interested in, as I've mentioned already, in opiate addiction and alcohol addiction. Now, the alcohol work has been done in the States, but we've got charitable funding to start a pilot study in heroin addiction, because it would be wonderful if we could help people who would spend their whole life fixated on and craving heroin could actually just be helped to sort of get out of that thought process, to get out of the addiction. And that study is going to start in the new year. And I'm obviously very hopeful. And if it does work, it's going to be a major breakthrough, because, we've got year on year, we've got more and more deaths from people using opiates. And it's going to get worse with the influx of these very toxic fentanyls from the States.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of other work then, so within your center, what other psychedelics work are you doing?
Yeah, well, so we had 2 sort of profiles. The first was we wanted to compare the brain effects of as many psychedelics as possible. So we've done really the definitive imaging work on psilocybin, on LSD, on DMT, and now we're starting the first detailed analysis of the drug called 5-methoxy-DMT, which you can get from toad. It's a sort of toad venom, which is extremely powerful. It's often called the God molecule. It produces very profound, very fast transitions into altered states of consciousness, often to different people going into different dimensions, different universes. So we want to know whether there are differences between the brain imaging, the brain signatures, the brain prints of these drugs. And that's a kind of interesting scientific question. But we're also on the clinical side. We want to know how widely we can utilize the psychedelic effects. So my team will be part of the team that have done the first depression study with DMT. Now, DMT is the active ingredient in ayahuasca. Which you can drink ayahuasca because it's got DMT plus an ingredient called harmaline, which is a monoamine oxidase inhibitor that prevents the breakdown of the DMT by the gut and the liver. So you can actually drink it; it gets to the brain. Now, we're not allowed to use that in the UK because no one knows exactly what this plant combination is. So we've used intravenous DMT. We've produced a sort of 20 to 30 minute trip, and my team have shown that can produce again quite powerful reductions in depression scores. That's actually beginning to challenge some of the conceptions we had. Up to that point, we thought that maybe the 4 to 5 hour experience that you have with psilocybin, in which people have an enormous amount of psychological experiences. They go into many, many aspects of their past life. And we used to think that that was actually really central to reframing their attitude to their illness. Now we're beginning to wonder, well, maybe just a 20, 30-minute trip can also somehow kind of reset a lot of those processes. So that's actually quite an interesting intellectual challenge. What is the optimal way? What's the optimal duration of the trip? So we're exploring that now.
Oh yeah. And then have you been doing any work on ketamine? And because obviously in the suicide field, obviously it's a lot of interest. But most of the work I'm aware of, the ketamine field, is not on the understanding the mechanisms of effect, but rather moving from the therapeutic impact of it. So have you been done any of the sort of basic science work on ketamine?
Yeah. And that's the problem. You hit the nail on the head there, Rory. The problem with ketamine is people have been using it without understanding it.
Well, because I was just curious. I'm unaware of reading any paper about the sort of that basic science stuff.
Not in humans. There are studies. There was a study from Vienna which shows it does disrupt the networks in a similar way to psilocybin. We're just completing a study now using a new PET probe called UCBJ, which is a PET probe that looks at synaptic vesicles and is a measure of the density of synaptic vesicles and can be used, in theory, at least in animals, to measure the production of new synapses. And so we've just finished a ketamine study where we've looked at whether there's a change in the density of this tracer. We predict it will go up as you get new synapses formed. But we've also been collaborating with a group at Oxford to see whether when you can rapidly change synaptic density. So you can rapidly change function in the brain. For instance, if you just tape a couple of fingers together so you can't move your fingers, you can get changes in the motor cortex. Then we've done that as well to see whether you get those changes and whether you can reverse them with ketamine. So that work is coming to fruition. That'll be finalized by the end of this year. And then we're planning then to move on to start looking at DMT. Because there is a general feeling that ketamine probably doesn't produce as enduring, as powerful neuroplasticity effects as the psychedelics, which is why you tend to have to use ketamine, repeatedly, maybe twice a week for 4 to 8 weeks, whereas DMT or psilocybin can produce a profound effect after a single dose. So we're interested in comparing those two psychedelics to see whether we can get a better handle on why they differ in terms of their duration of action.
Well, what's this space then? Obviously, to see what comes out of that. I'll have a particular interest in the work that we do, and obviously the new treatments for depression, obviously both psychological and obviously pharmacological.
Just to follow up on that point you made, Rory, though, I mean, there are people who, I don't know if you are, but there are groups in the States who are using ketamine, a short administration of ketamine to people who are in A&E departments, threatening suicide, and sort of that's kind of resetting. It's a similar conceptual model to resetting the brain in disorders like depression, and it's completely plausible that psychedelics might do it better than ketamine. So if when you're ready, we'll help you do the study.
I won't be doing the ketamine studies. I'll stick to my psychology. No, just curious, because obviously the short-term effects in some of the studies look certainly promising, but it's just, again, going back to an earlier point, A, understanding the mechanism, and then B, the longer-term effects, because we just don't know what the longer-term effects are yet, and I suppose. Well,
hang on, Rory, I'm a bit hesitant. I get asked this question a lot. Oh yeah, break it. This is all really exciting. How do you know in 5 years' time people won't grow a third head from taking a psilocybin trip? And I can say they won't. And I can tell you that because the ancient Greeks were using psychedelics 3,000 years ago in an interesting combination with alcohol, and they didn't seem to suffer any long-term consequences. There are 40,000 patients, registered patients in trials in the 50s and 60s, mostly with LSD, some with psilocybin. They didn't show any long-term problems. I think we can put to bed the idea that there's going to be a sudden emergence of a nasty, toxic corollary of using these drugs. That is something that the anti-drug lobby use a lot. There's a lot of people are trying to stop this happening because they don't want to admit to the fact that for 55 years, we've the people have been scared off these drugs, and they won't want to accept that they're wrong. So, yeah, I'm absolutely confident we won't find any long-term adverse effects, because we would have discovered them a long time ago.
Yeah, no, I no, and I totally respect that point of view. My point was more, I suppose, is a broader point about looking at the trials thus far have only shown any efficacy in a very short-term context. That's really what I mean. But then we have to hold psychological treatments to the same, compare the risks and harms of psychological treatments as well as pharmacological treatments. I think we have to have an even playing field. So no, it was just it wasn't.
It's very rare for a psychologist to say that. Well done, Rory.
No, well, I'm trying. Anyway, let's just.
You're an honest man. I wouldn't. That's why you're doing the podcast. They trust you. We trust you.
Well, I don't know about that, but no, I think it's we know there are harms.
Rory, I want to say a bit more about this, because I think.
Okay, go.
I've been teasing you because I've been sort of rehearsing and regurgitating the old, where psychiatrists versus psychologists. The great thing about psychedelics is that it brings them together. Because there is no question whatsoever that what we are looking at is a psychological change as well as a brain change. Mm-hmm. And we can use psychological inputs. So all those people that had failed CBT for their depression before psilocybin, it's perfectly plausible they could get benefits from it after you've flipped their mind into a state where they could use it, or they could even engage with it. So I like the term psychedelic psychotherapy. I like the idea that we're bringing our two disciplines together, because we need to, because the demand is enormous, and we can't, neither of us can actually handle it all ourselves. So I think this is the way of doing psychotherapy.
Well, that's the ethos of MQ as well. Our whole approach in MQ is it's to break down silos, and because the only way we're ever going to really make meaningful change in terms of mental health science and the treatment is by working obviously collaboratively across disciplines. And indeed, earlier this year, I co-led this Gone Too Soon project, which MQ led on with my colleague Carol Worthman, and we brought together 40 experts from 5 continents, and we're trying to understand what are the priorities for mental health, basically to reduce mortality, early mortality or premature mortality for mental illness and the comorbidities associated with mental illness. And one of the key messages was de-siloization. We've spent too long in our silos, and it helps nobody. So we're speaking from the same hymn sheet, David, I think. But it just
I'm really pleased. It's great.
Yeah, but you talk about the 10-year anniversary of MQ. Maybe what brings me on is thinking ahead then from your work, right? So in the next 10 or 20 years, where do you think we'll be? Because we move on a second to policy challenges, but where do you think we'll be in terms of the treatment, or both the understanding and treatment, and the role of psychedelics?
Oh, they will revolutionize psychiatry. They will revolutionize the treatment of any internalizing disorder, whether it's depression, eating disorders, whether it's addictions. There are already studies now in body dysmorphic disorder. They have the potential. They will be transformational, I think. And they're also fascinatingly, the neuroplasticity is now being evaluated at sub-psychedelic doses in neurological disorders like stroke. So this is a whole new branch of medicine, which is very exciting. Most Western countries will have adopted psychedelic therapy within 5 years, I think.
Oh, well, as soon as that?
Australia did last month. Last month, the Australian government approved psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression that had failed on 2 other treatments, one of which was a drug and one of which could be a drug or could be psychotherapy. Yeah.
But was there not some controversy over that, because did they go against the recommendations? Or I only remember reading this in the media, the recommendations of an advisory group or something?
Well, it was interesting, yes, because there were psychiatrists that didn't want it to happen. And there were psychotherapists that didn't want it to happen. But the government, their equivalent of our MHRA said, look, we lose one first responder, that's a fireman or a policeman or a paramedic, every day to suicide. And the potential benefits of psilocybin surely outweigh any potential risk. So they were kind of overruled. The TGA took a pragmatic view. We know a lot about these drugs. We know how they work, and we know they're pretty safe. If they're used in settings, if they're used in approved And that's a very interesting thing about the Australian model too. The first is that the therapist, the doctor, has to get approval from an ethics committee that they have competence. And the second is that the drug has been provided by a charity. And so here's an interesting question for MQ. If you had enough money, would you provide it rather than wait for a pharmaceutical company to come and provide it? And I'll let you think on that. But if the answer is yes, get back to me soon.
I'll ask my manager.
Yeah, thankfully that's above our pay grade. So to answer that question, David, just because our time is marching against us. So David, I want to just ask you a bit about, because you've had a lot of experience of trying to influence policy and working in policy in the UK and no doubt internationally as well. What could we be doing better if you just think more about any aspect of mental health science or psychiatry or whatever area it is? From your experience, what could we be doing better to really influence policymakers more directly or more effectively?
Well, yes, the important thing, I think, is keep banging the drum about evidence. I mean, we've talked about ketamine, haven't we? And, ketamine, in a way, was the first real breakthrough in depression treatments for 40 years, and a different way of acting, the first psychedelic. And yet it's not approved by NICE. Mm-hmm. And that is wrong. And that is because they've set barriers and hurdles which they wouldn't set to any other treatment, because it's a horse tranquilizer, because it's a psychedelic. And patients want this. Even the Royal College of Psychiatrists isn't usually that vocal a group. We're campaigning for it. But there's an anti-psychiatry movement in this country, which is actually very powerful, and it permeates even into Parliament, where there are kind of anti-psychiatry groups there. And I mean, that's one of the reasons I'm a great fan of you guys, MQ, because you are a truly independent voice of reason. People don't listen to me because they think I've been banging on about policy for so long, I'm biased, but you're not biased. So really stand up for the evidence and stand up for the patients who are being denied access to these treatments. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then if you want something concrete, get psychedelics rescheduled, get psilocybin moved out of Schedule 1, which says it can't be used, into Schedule 2, where it can be used. Yeah,
well, be interested to see what happens in that regard. So we're going to bring this sort of slowly to a close, David. So obviously you have a book out, which I can see behind you, behind whatever is your shoulder. There we go. And it's on psychedelics. So do you want to, so what was the aim of the book, the purpose of the book? And so tell us a bit about the book.
This is the third in a series. I was contracted to write 3 books, one on alcohol, which is called Drink, ? One on cannabis, Seeing Through the Smoke, and the third was on psychedelics. And they all serve the same goal, which is basically tell the truth about drugs, and not to be promoting them, not to be hostile to them, to lay down for the educated public reader what the truth is, what the evidence is, and how they can think, to allow them to have make a proper decision as to what they're going to do, either personally or in terms of, which kind of groups they might support if they want to look for change.
And that's available in all
good bookshops, absolutely, in all good bookshops, and also on the web from Yellow Kite Books.
Excellent. And so just before we usually end the podcast with a couple of sort of unrelated questions. I'll come to those in a second. But is there any sort of key message that we haven't discussed with regard to the work that you do or hope to do, which you would like to add before we sort of bring it to these last 2 questions?
I'm going to give a little bit of more of a shout out for PET scanning. I mean, the first brain PET scan was done in Britain. We led the world. The MRC cyclotron unit, which is why I went to Imperial to work, was absolutely world leading. Well, we've lost the plot to some extent, in the same way as we've lost the plot we were world leading in psychedelic research 10 years ago. We don't invest in our cutting edge technologies, and that is disappointing. And there's PET imaging is potentially transformational. It's expensive, and that's why we don't invest in it. But that it's a false economy. So I'm going to say that we really should be properly investing in innovation in that technology. We're brilliant. We're world leading at MR as well. We got the Nobel Prize for that. But we all, the fact is, it's not one or the other. We can't ignore the need for PET just because we're good at MRI.
Yeah, but I think that's a wider point. I think if you look over the last 10 years, the lack of investment, relative lack of investment in the infrastructure required to conduct high quality, world-class, world-leading mental health science and treatment, we just are falling behind, and we just that needs to be prioritized more. And Yeah, I think it is a big concern, a huge concern. And yep, PET is one example, but lots of examples. We just need more investment in infrastructure for mental health science.
I mean, I know, most any person that reads the evidence knows that the burden of mental health illness it's a bigger burden than diabetes and cardiovascular disease put together.
Yeah.
And the investment is less than half of either. So, it is completely disproportionate. And that's, I'm afraid, is a political attitude. Most politicians are very tough, resilient people, and they believe everyone is like them, and they don't understand that very few people are like them. Thankfully, most people aren't like them. Otherwise, it'd be even worse world.
But I'm not going to comment on that. But the one last point on, I was just watching. There was a Newsnight program on the BBC last night, and it was on the university sector, and in the context, obviously of the UCU marking boycott and the strike, and obviously the working conditions and so on. But one of the messages, one of the slides it showed, which really highlights his point, which is the cross-subsidization of research at universities. So our research, I mean, the cost of our research has mostly been, not mostly, but is certainly to a certain degree been subsidized by us increasing the number of international students to the UK. And that highlights the fact that we're just not doing the investment in science in general and research in general, but I would make the case specifically for mental health science.
I would utterly support you, and anytime you want me to beat that drum, I will. I have confronted ministers in the past about it. And if I'm any use to you, I will do it again.
Well, but the thing is, it makes sense. And so economically, it makes sense to invest. But anyway, we don't need to rehearse.
Well, I'll just, Rory, probably before you even were not born, but certainly 20 years ago, there was a very high level meeting with the Department of Employment and the Treasury. And they knew, we all said the burden of depression in terms of the unemployment and the costs of keeping people, on Social Security is vast.
Yeah.
And all the enormous extra costs in terms of pensions, because people are pensioned off sick. I was running depression clinics back in Bristol in the 1990s when they changed the pension rules for teachers. So many teachers went off sick without even being treated for depression we incentivized people to get out of the workplace because they were mentally ill, and we've lost an enormous resource there. So governments know the economic value of mental wellness. It's just that they won't invest in it because they don't see it's an immediate return, and it's not a vote winner for some reason.
I know, sadly, but I think that's changing. That's changed a bit in the last 20 years, but not enough. So on that note, then, so David, two last quick questions then, just to bring us to a close. This is something completely different. So just reflecting then on your obviously career, and then looking backwards, what advice would you give your 16-year-old self?
Oh, be more diplomatic, be a bit less abrasive, I think. Maybe a bit more targeted. I think, no, I don't. Yes, I think I kind of did all right. I'm not quite, but maybe a little bit more tactful at some points might have. Oh, I'll give everyone one really important piece of advice. One of the most near misses in my career, which I didn't learn about till afterwards, was making a joke in a job interview, which went down apparently very, very badly and almost lost me the job. I only learned about it when I was leaving the job 6 months later.
Good advice. Good advice.
Never. Yeah, that's right. Doctors don't have much of a sense of humor, actually.
And then the last question is, so if you had the choice of inviting or having coffee or dinner with one or two people, living or dead, who would you, and you haven't had that opportunity thus far, who would they be?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. Yeah, I think I'd quite like to resurrect Crick, so we could have a sensible discussion with him about why he went to America. I mean, the rumor is he went to America because the police, after we made LSD illegal in '68, the police started coming around to his house, which of course they could identify quite well because he stuck a great golden helix outside, and they told him he had to stop having these parties. So I'd like to speak to Crick about what, because I like to share with him our insights into the brain, which I think he would find very appealing. And I think yes, it'd have to be Aldous Huxley, wouldn't it? Because I mean, sure. Both a genius and a visionary, and a man who, his book Island is his last book Island is a really brilliant exposition as how you can actually use a combination of therapies. It's not just psychedelics, but also dance therapy, psychological therapy, social therapy to actually make a better society. And yeah, that would be a really rather interesting dinner party, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would be a great dinner party. And on that note, a great ending on a Huxley as a dinner party is a great way to end. So on behalf of Craig and I and MQ, David, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. And let's see where we are in 5 or 10 years to see whether your prediction comes true about the centrality of psychedelics transforming mental health treatment. So thank you so much.
Well, I hope I'm alive to see it. But if not, will you raise a glass to me, Rory?
I will indeed. I will indeed.